June 4th, 1942, dawned with deceptive calm over the Central Pacific, where Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded the most powerful naval strike force ever assembled under one flag. His 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, had demonstrated their lethal efficiency 6 months earlier at Pearl Harbor, and now they steamed toward Midway with absolute confidence that American resistance would crumble within hours. Before we dive deeper, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Grab yourself a warm drink, maybe a cup of tea or just some water, and sit back as we begin this journey together. The Japanese Imperial Navy possessed what military historians would later describe as a supremacy complex, forged through victories that stretched from Hawaii to the Indian Ocean without a single meaningful defeat. Nagumo stood on Akagi's bridge as dawn broke, watching his carrier group cut through Pacific swells with mechanical precision. The admiral carried with him the weight of Emperor Hirohito's expectations and Admiral Isuroku Yamamoto's strategic vision. This operation represented more than a tactical objective. It embodied Japan's determination to establish an impregnable defensive perimeter that would force President Franklin Roosevelt to negotiate peace on Tokyo's terms. The intelligence estimate seemed irrefutable. American naval power in the Pacific had been crippled at Pearl Harbor, and only 2 or 3 carriers remained operational to defend the entire ocean theater. The broader strategic context revealed Japan's desperate gamble. According to military records examined by historian Gordon Prank in his seminal work on Pacific naval warfare, Japanese war planners understood that America's industrial capacity would eventually overwhelm their island nation. They needed a decisive victory that would shatter American morale before the United States could mobilize its vast resources. Midway, a tiny speck of coral sand positioned strategically northwest of Hawaii, became the chosen killing ground, where remaining American carriers would be lured into a trap and destroyed. Commander Mitsuo Fua, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, now served as Nagumo's air operations officer aboard Akagi. He watched flight deck crews preparing Kate torpedo bombers and Val dive bombers for the initial strike against Midway's installations. The ritual unfolded with practiced efficiency. Ordnance crews wheeling bombs from below decks, mechanics performing final checks on Nakajima engines, pilots gathering for briefings in ready rooms thick with cigarette smoke and nervous energy. Every man aboard those 4 carriers believed they were participating in an operation that would effectively end the Pacific War before summer's conclusion. Yet beneath this supreme confidence lurked operational realities that would prove catastrophic. Nagumo's carriers operated under divided objectives. They needed to suppress Midway's shore installations while remaining prepared to engage any American carriers that might unexpectedly appear. This dual mission created a vulnerability that Japanese planners had insufficiently considered. Additionally, the same mechanical precision that made the Kido Butai so formidable also made it inflexible. Japanese doctrine emphasized tight formations and synchronized operations, leaving little room for improvisation when circumstances deteriorated as morning light strengthened across the Pacific. Nagumo's strike force maintained radio silence. Unaware that American codebreakers had already stripped away their element of surprise, the admiral believed he was orchestrating a perfectly executed operation against an inferior opponent. Instead, he was steaming directly toward the most consequential 5 minutes in naval warfare history, a span of time that would transform the Pacific War's entire trajectory and doom Japan's carrier aviation force to destruction. 3,000 miles away, in a basement facility at Pearl Harbor, Commander Joseph Rochefort over intelligence reports that represented perhaps the most significant cryptoanalytic achievement in military history. For months, his Station Hypo team had been systematically breaking Japanese naval code JN-25, piecing together fragments of enemy communications like archaeologists reconstructing ancient pottery. By late May 1942, Rochefort had accumulated enough evidence to make an audacious claim. The Japanese were planning a massive operation against an objective designated AF in their coded messages. The challenge lay in confirming that AF represented Midway rather than some other target. Rochefort devised an ingenious verification scheme. He convinced Midway's garrison to transmit an uncoded message reporting water distillation equipment failure, a plausible mechanical issue for a remote Pacific base. Within 48 hours, Japanese intelligence intercepts referenced AF experiencing freshwater supply problems. The trap had worked perfectly, providing Admiral Chester Nimitz with ironclad confirmation that Midway would be the target. This intelligence breakthrough fundamentally altered the Pacific balance of power in ways that extended far beyond immediate tactical advantages. Nimitz now possessed something no defending commander could normally expect: comprehensive knowledge of his opponent's intentions, force composition, and timing. He knew that Nagumo commanded 4 fleet carriers supported by battleships and cruisers. He knew the attack date. He knew the Japanese planned a diversionary operation against the Aleutian Islands to draw American forces northward. Most importantly, he knew he could position his own carriers northeast of Midway, where they could ambush the Japanese strike force. The American carrier force that Nimitz assembled represented everything remaining of Pacific Fleet aviation. Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher commanded Task Force 17 from carrier Yorktown, a vessel so heavily damaged at the Battle of Coral Sea just weeks earlier that Pearl Harbor shipyard workers estimated 3 months would be required for proper repairs. Nimitz gave them 72 hours. Welders and pipe fitters worked around the clock, performing emergency patches, while Yorktown's crew took on fuel, ammunition, and replacement aircraft. The carrier departed Pearl Harbor on May 30th, with civilian contractors still aboard completing repairs underway. Rear Admiral Raymond Spruant commanded Task Force 16, built around carriers Enterprise and Hornet. Spruant represented an unusual choice for carrier command. He was a cruiser admiral with limited aviation experience, selected only because Vice Admiral William Holley had been hospitalized with severe dermatitis. Yet this apparent disadvantage would prove fortuitous. Spruant brought methodical tactical thinking unencumbered by the aggressive instincts that might have led other commanders into rash decisions. He understood his role required patience and precise timing rather than dramatic gestures. The American force rendezvoused northeast of Midway on June 2nd, establishing patrol sectors and refueling operations while maintaining strict radio silence. Fletcher, as senior officer present, exercised overall tactical command, though he wisely gave Spruant considerable operational latitude. Together they commanded 3 carriers, with approximately 233 aircraft, facing Nagumo's 4 carriers with 248 aircraft. The numerical disparity seemed minimal, but American pilots lacked the combat experience their Japanese counterparts had accumulated through years of warfare in China and 6 months of Pacific operations. What American forces possessed instead was knowledge and position. Fletcher's carriers waited in waters where Japanese reconnaissance expected emptiness. When Nagumo launched his Midway strike at dawn on June 4th, he did so believing the nearest American carriers were back at Pearl Harbor. That miscalculation, combined with the operational rigidity built into Japanese carrier doctrine, would create an opening that American pilots would exploit with devastating effect. The stage was set for an engagement that neither side could afford to lose, and that one side didn't even know was about to begin. At 4:30 on the morning of June 4th, Nagumo's carriers turned into the wind and began launching 108 aircraft toward Midway, 36 Kate bombers, 36 Valdiv bombers, and 36 Zero fighters. Lieutenant Joy Chi Tomaga led the strike, his formation assembling in the pre-dawn darkness before turning southeast toward their target. Behind them, on the carrier decks, flight crews prepared a reserve strike force, 93 aircraft armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, specifically configured for anti-shipping operations. These reserve aircraft represented Nagumo's insurance policy against unexpected American carriers. Tomaga's strike reached Midway at 6:30, encountering fierce anti-aircraft fire and determined resistance from Marine fighter squadrons equipped with obsolete Brewster Buffalo and Wildcat fighters. The Japanese bombers plastered the atoll's installations, destroying fuel tanks and damaging facilities, but failed to neutralize the runways or suppress the island's defensive capabilities. As Tomaga withdrew, he radioed a crucial assessment back to Nagumo: there is need for a second attack wave. This message initiated the cascade of decisions that would doom the Japanese carrier force. Meanwhile, Midway-based aircraft had launched their own counterattacks against Nagumo's carriers. Antiquated Vindicator dive bombers, lumbering Avenger torpedo planes, and flying Fortress heavy bombers attacked in uncoordinated waves throughout the morning. Every attack failed. Anti-aircraft fire and zero combat air patrols shredded the obsolete American aircraft without scoring a single hit. Yet, these futile assaults accomplished something more valuable than damage. They kept Nagumo's force on edge, constantly maneuvering and launching fighters to intercept successive threats. At 7:15, Nagumo faced the most consequential decision of his career. Tomaga's request for a second Midway strike required rearming the reserve aircraft, replacing their anti-H ship torpedoes and bombs with land attack ordnance. Standard Japanese doctrine called for maintaining a reserve strike force armed for carrier attacks until enemy fleet units were confirmed absent from the operational area. But reconnaissance had reported nothing, and Midway's installations clearly remained functional. Nagumo ordered the rearmament to proceed. The hangar decks below Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu erupted into controlled chaos as ordnance crews began the laborious process of striking torpedoes below and bringing up land bombs. This operation required meticulous care. Torpedoes couldn't simply be carelessly handled, and bombs needed proper fusing before mounting. Aviation gasoline lines remained pressurized, ammunition belts lay exposed, and aircraft packed the enclosed spaces with wings nearly touching. Every safety regulation emphasized keeping ordnance handling to minimum necessary levels, but operational tempo now demanded speed over caution. At 7:28, a Japanese reconnaissance float plane launched 2 hours late due to catapult malfunctions, finally radioed a stunning report. Have sighted 10 enemy surface ships bearing 10 degrees distance 240 miles from Midway. Nagumo's assumption shattered instantly. American ships, possibly including carriers, lurked exactly where they weren't supposed to be. The admiral immediately ordered the rearmament process suspended and then reversed again to anti-ship configuration. Down in the hangar decks, frustrated ordnance crews now faced the task of removing the land bombs they just mounted and replacing them with the torpedoes they'd struck below 30 minutes earlier. This indecision created exactly the vulnerability that Japanese carrier doctrine sought to avoid. The reserve strike force remained trapped in a state of disorganized transition. Aircraft armed with wrong ordnance, fuel lines exposed, bombs and torpedoes cluttering deck spaces instead of being properly stowed in magazines. Additionally, Tomaga's returning Midway strike force was now approaching, desperately low on fuel and requiring immediate landing. Nagumo faced an impossible choice: keep his decks clear to launch an immediate strike against the American fleet, or recover his Midway strike force before pilots began ditching in the ocean. He chose to recover aircraft first, a decision that would seal his force's fate. Aboard Enterprise Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey received the order to launch at 702 earlier than preferred, but necessitated by the developing tactical situation. His dive bomber squadron lifted off Enterprise's deck, followed by additional Dauntless squadrons from both Enterprise and Hornet. The American strike comprised 54 dive bombers, 29 torpedo planes, and 20 escorting Wildcat fighters. Virtually everything Fletcher and Spruant could commit to a single coordinated attack, yet coordination existed only in theory. The reality would be far messier. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron commanded Hornets' Torpedo Squadron 8, flying the obsolete Douglas Devastator torpedo bomber. The Devastator represented technology from the 1930, slow, poorly armed, and vulnerable to both fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Worse, American aerial torpedoes suffered from disastrous reliability problems, with more than half failing to explode even when they struck targets. Waldron understood these limitations intimately, yet he also understood his squadron's role. Torpedo attacks forced enemy carriers to maneuver, disrupting their operations and potentially creating opportunities for dive bombers. The American strike groups departed on slightly divergent headings, a navigation error that would fragment the coordinated attack, but paradoxically extend its duration over target. Waldron took Torpedo 8 on a more westerly heading based on his intuition about where Nagumo's carriers should be positioned. His guess proved correct. At 920, Torpedo 8 spotted the Japanese fleet below. 4 carriers steaming in formation, surrounded by protecting battleships and cruisers. Waldron waggled his wings and pushed into his attack run, knowing that without fighter escort or dive bomber support, his squadron faced annihilation. 0 fighters fell upon Torpedo, 8 like wolves on wounded prey. Within 6 minutes, all 15 devastators were shot down. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor, clung to a floating seat cushion and watched the battle unfold from water level, an unlikely witness to history's most dramatic carrier engagement. Waldron died in his burning aircraft, having pressed his attack to within 800 yards of the Japanese carriers without launching a single torpedo that struck home. The sacrifice seemed futile, achieving nothing but adding 15 names to casualty lists. Yet, Torpedo 8's destruction drew Japanese fighters down to wave-top level, exactly where American torpedo squadrons needed enemy combat air patrol to be. Enterprise's Torpedo 6 and Yorktown's Torpedo 3 followed minutes behind Waldron, attacking from different angles. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay led Torpedo 6 inches from the southwest, his squadron disintegrating under 0 fire before reaching launch range. Lindsay died with most of his pilots, scoring no hits. Commander Lance Massey brought Torpedo 3 inches from the east, achieving slightly better geometry, but meeting identical results. His squadron shot to pieces, Massey killed. No torpedo hits achieved. Of 41 torpedo bombers launched that morning, 35 were destroyed. The survivors limped back to carriers, their crews devastated by losses that seemed to accomplish nothing. In the ready rooms, pilots who'd watched friends take off to certain death struggled to process the magnitude of failure. American torpedo doctrine, aircraft and weapons, had proven catastrophically inadequate against a competent enemy. Yet, this apparent futility masked a crucial reality. The torpedo attacks had dragged Japanese fighters down to low altitude at the precise moment when American dive bombers arrived overhead. Nagumo's carriers completed recovering Tamaga's Midway strike force at 918, flight decks now crowded with aircraft being respotted for launch. The anti-ship strike that would destroy Fletcher's carriers before they could launch additional attacks. Ordnance crews rushed to complete rearming, leaving bombs and torpedoes scattered across hangar decks, rather than properly stowed in armored magazines. Fuel lines remained pressurized to speed refueling operations. Every safety margin had been sacrificed to operational tempo, transforming the carriers into floating ammunition depots, primed for catastrophic destruction. At 10:24, lookouts aboard Akagi spotted American dive bombers, beginning their attack runs from 17,000 feet. The Zeros that might have intercepted them remained at low altitude, having just finished slaughtering torpedo squadrons. Nagumo's carriers presented perfect targets, decks packed with fully fueled, fully armed aircraft, crews exposed, and no time to take evasive action. The 5-minute window that would decide the Pacific War had arrived, and Japanese naval aviation stood directly in its path with no possibility of escape. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey had been searching for Nagumo's carriers for over an hour, his fuel gauges dropping toward the point of no return. Enterprise's dive bombers had flown the expected intercept heading and found empty ocean. Nagumo's course changes while evading torpedo attacks had carried his force away from predicted positions. McCluskey faced a decision that separated competent officers from exceptional ones. Continue searching beyond prudent fuel reserves, or abandon the mission and return to Enterprise. He chose to search, extending southwest on pure tactical intuition. At 9:55, a lone Japanese destroyer caught McCluskey's attention. The warship Arashi was steaming at high speed, creating a distinctive white wake across the otherwise empty sea. The destroyer had been depth charging the American submarine Nautilus and was now racing to rejoin Nagumo's formation. McCluskey made an instant calculation. That destroyer was heading somewhere important. He followed Arashi's wake northwest, and at 10:20, spotted what one pilot later described as a carrier commander's dream. 4 Japanese flat-tops in box formation, decks crowded with aircraft. No indication they detected the American dive bombers poised 17,000 feet overhead. McCluskey immediately began coordinating the attack, assigning squadrons to specific targets. His Enterprise air group would strike the nearest carriers, while Yorktown's bombers, which had arrived separately moments earlier under Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, would engage others. The coordination was improvised and imperfect, but adequate. McCluskey rolled into his dive at 10:22, followed by 36 Dauntless dive bombers in a choreographed death plunge that represented American naval aviation's finest moment. The Dauntless proved itself that morning as one of World War II's great aircraft designs. Unlike the obsolete Devastator, the Dauntless was rugged, stable in dives, and equipped with effective dive brakes that allowed pilots to maintain precise control during the near-vertical attack runs. Pilots pushed into 70 degrees dives, accelerating toward terminal velocity while keeping their target fixed in simple ring and bead gun sights. At 1,500 feet, they released 1,000 armor-piercing bombs converted from naval artillery shells, then pulled out into crushing 9G recoveries that grayed vision and strained airframes to designed limits. The explosion touched off a chain reaction of devastating secondary detonations. Aviation gasoline ignited in rolling fireballs that swept through enclosed hangar spaces. Bombs and torpedoes scattered across the deck for quick rearming, now detonated sympathetically, each blast triggering additional explosions. Within minutes, Akagi transformed from the Imperial Navy's most powerful carrier into a floating crematorium where temperatures exceeded 2,000 degrees F. Sailors trapped below decks died instantly, or faced the impossible choice between burning alive and jumping into an oil-slicked sea that offered only a slightly slower death. Simultaneously, other dive bombers struck Kaga and Soryu with equal precision. Kaga took 4 direct hits in rapid succession, each bomb penetrating flight decks before exploding deep within the ship's vitals. The carrier's forward magazines detonated with such force that the blast wave killed everyone on the bridge instantly, including the captain. Soryu, slightly smaller but equally vulnerable, absorbed 3 hits that set off identical catastrophic fires. All 3 carriers were effectively destroyed within the space of 5 minutes, though their death agonies would continue for hours as fires raged beyond any possibility of control. Commander Mitsuo Fua, recovering from an appendectomy in Akagi sickbay, found himself trapped in a burning ship that he believed unsinkable that same morning. He later described the scene as transcending comprehension, explosions recurring every few seconds, bulkheads glowing red-hot, screaming men with clothing and flesh burning. Water mains ruptured so that damage control parties possessed no means of fighting fires. The supreme confidence that had characterized the Quito Eye just hours earlier had been replaced by shock and disbelief. How had this happened? Where had the American dive bombers come from? Why had no one detected them in time? The answers lay in a confluence of circumstances that operational plans could never fully account for. The torpedo squadron's sacrificial attacks had pulled Japanese fighters out of position at the critical moment. Nagumo's decision to recover aircraft rather than launch immediately had left his flight decks crowded and vulnerable. American codering had eliminated Japanese surprise while enabling Fletcher to position his carriers in an unexpected sector. Most fundamentally, 5 minutes of extraordinary precision bombing by highly trained American pilots had exploited a brief vulnerability window that Japanese doctrine had assumed would never exist. 3 of Japan's 6 fleet carriers, 50% of the Navy's most valuable assets, had been destroyed in less time than it took to hard-boil an egg, and the battle was only half finished. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi commanded carrier Hiru, positioned several miles north of the stricken flat tops when McCluskey's dive bombers struck. From Here's Bridge, Yamaguchi watched columns of black smoke rising from his sister carriers, immediately understanding that the entire operational situation had inverted within minutes. He alone commanded an undamaged carrier capable of launching strikes, and Japanese doctrine gave him no time to contemplate the psychological impact of witnessing 3 fleet carriers burning simultaneously. Yamaguchi ordered immediate preparations for a counterstrike. While every instinct screamed that something impossible had just occurred, Lieutenant Mio Kobayashi led Hiryu's first wave. 18 Valdiv bombers and 6 Zero fighters, everything Yamaguchi could launch immediately. The strike departed at 1054 with orders to locate and destroy at least 1 American carrier. Kobayashi navigated using reverse headings from the American dive bombers' retirement routes, correctly calculating that following their withdrawal track would lead to Fletcher's carriers. At 12:06, his formation spotted Yorktown below, steaming independently after Fletcher had transferred his flag to the cruiser Atoria following communication equipment damage. Yorktown's radar detected Kobayashi's approach at 46 miles, providing precious minutes for preparation. Captain Elliot Buckmaster cleared flight decks, ensuring every aircraft capable of flight was airborne. No sense providing secondary explosions with convenient fuel. Damage control parties closed watertight doors and set conditions throughout the ship for maximum survivability. Fighter directors vetoed Wildcat combat air patrols toward the incoming strike, positioning them for intercept. Everything that could be done to ready the carrier for attack was accomplished with disciplined efficiency. The Japanese dive bombers pushed through anti-aircraft fire and fighter interception that destroyed 10 of 18 attackers. But the survivors pressed home their attack with skill forged through years of training. 3 bombs struck Yorktown in rapid succession. The first penetrated the flight deck near the island superstructure, exploding deep within the ship and snuffing out boiler fires that left the carrier dead in the water. The second hit near the funnel, rupturing uptakes and filling engineering spaces with smoke. The third struck farther aft, causing additional flooding and structural damage. Within minutes, Yorktown listed and appeared to be sinking. Yet, American damage control doctrine emphasized redundancy and survivability in ways Japanese design philosophy had sacrificed for offensive capability. Yorktown's damage control parties responded with practiced efficiency, establishing portable pumps, rigging emergency communications, and counter-flooding to correct the list. Within 2 hours, engineering crews had restored power to enough boilers to give the carrier 20 knots. Buckmaster got his ship underway again, taking aboard aircraft and preparing to resume flight operations. The carrier the Japanese pilots reported destroyed was improbably recovering from what should have been mortal wounds. Yamaguchi launched a second strike at 13:30, 10 Kate torpedo bombers, and 6 Zeros under Lieutenant Joy Tomaga, who volunteered to lead despite his aircraft suffering fuel tank damage during the Midway strike that morning. Tomaga knew he lacked sufficient fuel to return to Hiryu, effectively making this a one-way mission. But Japanese warrior culture left no room for declining such assignments. When honor demanded sacrifice, his formation departed, knowing they represented Hiru's final offensive effort. No more aircraft remained serviceable for additional strikes. The torpedo attack developed at 1,445, with Kates approaching Yorktown from multiple angles to split the carrier's defensive fire and complicate evasion. Tominaga led from the front, his damaged aircraft absorbing concentrated anti-aircraft fire before disintegrating into the sea just yards from Yorktown's hull. 2 torpedoes struck the carrier's port side, the underwater explosions rupturing fuel tanks and flooding engineering spaces. This time the damage exceeded even American damage control capabilities. Buckmaster gave the order to abandon ship at 15, convinced his vessel was doomed. Yorktown's destruction seemed to offer Yamaguchi some measure of retaliation for the catastrophe that had befallen Nagumo's force. Yet the tactical calculation remained grimly unfavorable. Japan had already lost 3 irreplaceable fleet carriers and would lose Hiru within hours. Trading Yorktown for Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiyu represented the opposite of a favorable exchange. Moreover, Enterprise and Hornet remained undamaged and fully operational. The correlation of forces in the Central Pacific had shifted irrevocably in America's favor, and no amount of individual courage or tactical skill could reverse that strategic reality through further combat. While Yamaguchi's strike was destroying Yorktown, American search efforts finally located the 4th Japanese carrier. A scout plane from Yorktown launched before the torpedo attack, radioed Here's position at 1,545, bearing northwest approximately 110 miles from Enterprise. Rear Admiral Raymond Spruant immediately ordered a strike prepared, understanding that allowing Hiru to escape would leave the Japanese with 1 operational fleet carrier versus America's 2, an unacceptable outcome after sacrificing so much to achieve advantage. Lieutenant Earl Gallagher led 24 dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise in what would be the final carrier attack of the battle. His formation departed at 1,600 hours, navigating toward coordinates where Japanese doctrine suggested here you would be found. The late afternoon attack meant returning after dark, a hazardous proposition for pilots with limited night flying experience, but Spruant deemed the risk acceptable. Allowing Hiru to survive would squander the morning's victory and potentially enable future Japanese operations once the carrier had been reinforced with replacement aircraft. Gallagher's formation located here. U at 1,705, the carrier steaming desperately northward in hopes of evading additional American attacks. Yamaguchi had positioned his last operational fighters as combat air patrol overhead, but too few Zeros remained to effectively protect the carrier against 24 determined dive bombers. Gallagher divided his formation, attacking from multiple directions simultaneously, to overwhelm defenders and split anti-aircraft fire. The dive bombers pushed through to release altitude despite Zero attacks that damaged several aircraft. 4 bombs struck here in rapid succession. The impact spaced across the carrier's length from bow to stern. Each penetrated the flight deck before detonating within the ship's vitals, starting uncontrollable fires similar to those consuming the other Japanese carriers. Hiru's damage control parties fought desperately to contain the blazes, but the same vulnerabilities that had doomed Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu now sealed Hiru's fate. Gasoline fires spread through ventilation systems. Magazines began cooking off from heat, and structural bulkheads warped from temperatures exceeding their design tolerances. Yamaguchi remained on Hiru's bridge as fires spread throughout his flagship, refusing to abandon ship while any of his crew remained aboard. The admiral understood with perfect clarity that this defeat transcended normal military setbacks. Japan's entire carrier force had been destroyed in a single day's fighting, eliminating offensive capabilities that had taken a decade to build and could not be rapidly replaced. The strategic implications were catastrophic, though it would be months before Tokyo fully acknowledged how completely the balance had shifted. By midnight, Hiru's fires had progressed beyond any possibility of control. The carrier's engineering spaces had lost all power, leaving damage control parties unable to pump water or ventilate smoke. Survivors assembled on the listing flight deck, preparing to abandon the vessel that represented their professional lives and national prestige. Yamaguchi and Captain Toyoku both chose to remain aboard, going down with their ship in accordance with Japanese naval tradition. At dawn on June 5th, destroyers torpedoed Hiru's hulk, sending the last of Nagumo's fleet carriers to the bottom. The 4 carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, that had terrorized the Indian Ocean and demonstrated Japanese invincibility from Hawaii to Ceylon, now rested on the Pacific floor northeast of Midway Atoll. With them went approximately 300 aircraft, and more critically, hundreds of irreplaceable aircrew who represented Japan's finest naval aviators. Training replacements would require years, assuming instructors and aircraft could be spared from frontline operations. Japan possessed additional carriers under construction, but they would enter service with novice pilots facing increasingly experienced American opponents who had just proven their ability to destroy Japanese naval aviation under equal combat conditions. 300 meters to the west, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto received reports aboard his flagship Yamato with mounting incredul. The architect of Pearl Harbor in the Midway operation had positioned himself with the main battle fleet, expecting to engage American surface forces after Nagumo's carriers had destroyed Fletcher's flat ops. Instead, fragmentary radio transmissions described an unfolding catastrophe that reversed every planning assumption. By midnight on June 4th, Yamamoto understood that 4 fleet carriers had been lost, permanently lost, along with their irreplaceable air groups. Yamamoto faced the fundamental decision that defines military command, whether to reinforce failure by committing additional forces or accept defeat and withdraw. Japanese doctrine and warrior culture pushed toward the former. Battleship Yamato alone mounted 18.1 inches guns that could obliterate any American ship if surface action could be forced. The combined fleet still possessed overwhelming superiority in battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. If Midway's garrison could be seized and American carriers lured into night surface action, perhaps the disaster could be mitigated. Yet Yamamoto was nothing, if not a realist, about modern naval warfare. He understood that battleships without air cover were simply targets for carrier aircraft, and he no longer possessed any air cover whatsoever. Fletcher's remaining carriers could attack the combined fleet at will come daylight, and Japanese anti-aircraft capabilities were insufficient to prevent determined dive bomber attacks from crippling capital ships. The very vulnerability that had doomed his carriers would apply equally to battleships if they advanced within American strike range. At 2:55 a.m. on June 5th, Yamamoto issued the order that acknowledged defeat. Occupation of Midway is cancelled. The combined fleet would withdraw westward, abandoning not merely the island objective, but the entire strategic concept that Midway represented. The planned decisive battle that would force American capitulation would not occur. Instead, Japan would face a long defensive campaign against an opponent whose industrial capacity exceeded Japanese production by factors that made ultimate defeat mathematically inevitable, unless political resolution could be achieved through defensive attrition. The withdrawal itself tested Japanese seamanship and coordination. Cruisers Moami and Makuma collided during nighttime evasion maneuvers, suffering severe damage that left both vulnerable to American air attack. Makuma was sunk by Enterprise dive bombers on June 6, adding another warship to the casualty list. Moami barely survived, limping back to Japan with her bow crushed in hundreds of casualties. These additional losses hammered home the reality that Japan's navy had suffered a comprehensive defeat rather than merely an unfortunate setback. As the combined fleet steamed westward toward Japanese waters, officers throughout the force struggled to process what had occurred. How had overwhelming superiority transformed into catastrophic defeat in the space of 5 minutes? Explanations ranged from cowardly American surprise attacks to unfortunate coincidence to operational errors by subordinate commanders. The more perceptive officers recognized deeper problems: intelligence failures, operational inflexibility, inadequate damage control procedures, and a supremacy complex that had blinded planners to American capabilities. Yamamoto understood that this defeat marked a fundamental turning point. Japan had lost the initiative in the Pacific and would never regain it. American industrial production would now generate carriers, aircraft, and trained pilots faster than Japanese forces could destroy them. The defensive perimeter strategy that Midway was supposed to establish had collapsed before implementation. Most critically, American morale had received a tremendous boost precisely when Japanese strategy required American despair. The psychological impact would prove as significant as the material losses. Americans now believed they could win the Pacific War, while Japanese increasingly suspected they might lose it. While Yamamoto withdrew westward, the carrier Yorktown remained afloat northeast of Midway, abandoned, but not yet sunk. Captain Buckmaster's decision to evacuate had been prudent given the severe damage and apparent likelihood of capsizing. But American salvage doctrine emphasized that ships stayed valuable until they actually sank. On June 5th, salvage teams returned to the battered carrier to assess whether she could be saved and towed back to Pearl Harbor for repairs. Commander Clarence Aldrich led a salvage party of 29 officers and men who reboarded Yorktown on the afternoon of June 5th. They found the carrier listing 17 degrees dead in the water with flooding continuing in several compartments. Yet the hull remained intact, bulkheads held, and damage control equipment remained functional. Aldrich's team began the laborious work of establishing pumps, closing valves, and correcting the list through counter-flooding. By evening, they had reduced the list to 14 degrees and stopped progressive flooding. The carrier might yet survive. Destroyer Hammond came alongside on June 6th to provide electrical power and additional pumping capacity. The combined salvage effort made steady progress throughout that day, with optimism growing that Yorktown could indeed be saved. Tug Vero prepared to take the carrier under tow for the slow journey back to Pearl Harbor. The damaged flat top represented too valuable an asset to abandon. Properly repaired, she could return to combat operations within months, significantly offsetting the loss of carriers at Coral Sea and Midway. Yet, Japanese submarine I-168, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe, had been shadowing American forces since June 4th, waiting for an opportunity to strike. On June 6th, at 1:36 p.m., Tanabe achieved perfect attack geometry. Yorktown immobilized destroyer Hammond alongside, and screening vessels temporarily out of position. He fired a spread of 4 Type 95 torpedoes from less than 12,200 yards, a range that made missing almost impossible. 3 torpedoes struck with devastating effect. One hit Hammond directly amidships, breaking the destroyer's back and causing her to sink within 4 minutes with heavy loss of life. Two others struck Yorktown on the starboard side, the underwater explosions rupturing compartments that salvage teams had just pumped dry. The carrier's list immediately increased as thousands of tons of seawater poured into breached hull sections. Progressive flooding accelerated beyond any salvage party's capacity to control, and Aldrich reluctantly ordered his teams to abandon ship for the second time. Yorktown remained afloat through the night of June 6th, listing progressively further as internal flooding overwhelmed remaining watertight integrity. Sailors who'd served aboard her stood on accompanying destroyers, watching their ship die in slow motion. At dawn on June 7th, the list exceeded 70 degrees, the carrier's island superstructure nearly touching the water. At 5:04 a.m., Yorktown rolled completely over and sank stern first, her bow pointing skyward for several minutes before sliding beneath the Pacific swells, 2,400 fathoms to the ocean floor. The carrier's loss, though painful, barely diminished the strategic victory. 3 weeks after the battle concluded, Admiral Chester Nimitz stood before a map of the Pacific in his headquarters office at Pearl Harbor, analyzing intelligence reports that confirmed what senior American commanders had scarcely dared hope. Japanese naval construction schedules indicated no fleet carriers would enter service before late 1943 at the earliest. While American shipyards were launching Essex-class carriers at accelerating rates, the material balance in carrier aviation had shifted decisively, and Japan possessed no realistic means of reversing that advantage before American numerical superiority became overwhelming. The human cost of those 5 minutes at 10:30 a.m. on June 4th extended far beyond the immediate casualties. Japan lost approximately 3,000 personnel at Midway, including hundreds of experienced aircrew whose training had consumed years and resources that could not be quickly replicated. American losses totaled approximately 360, including the torpedo squadron pilots whose sacrifice had enabled the dive bombers' successful attacks. These numbers, stark in isolation, represented different things to the two nations. For America, casualties that industrial capacity and population could absorb. For Japan, irreplaceable expertise lost forever. Tokyo's initial response combined censorship with propaganda, attempting to minimize the defeat's significance. Newspapers received instructions to mention only that one carrier sustained damage during operations near Midway. Wounded survivors were quarantined to prevent information leakage. Even within the Navy, junior officers often remained unaware of the full scope of the disaster for weeks. Emperor Hirohito received accurate reports, but constrained by constitutional limitations and military-dominated government structures, exercised minimal influence over strategic decisions. The Japanese people would learn the truth only through accumulated defeats that no amount of propaganda could disguise. American intelligence services, conversely, recognized immediately that Midway represented the Pacific War's turning point. President Franklin Roosevelt received detailed briefings confirming that Japanese carrier aviation had been crippled, opening possibilities for offensive operations that would have been unthinkable just days earlier. According to contemporary military analyses referenced in Samuel Eliot Morrison's comprehensive naval history series, American strategic planners began developing what would become the twin-axis advance through the Central and Southwest Pacific, operations only feasible because Midway had secured American carrier supremacy. The psychological impact transcended tactical calculations. American morale, battered by 6 months of uninterrupted defeats from Pearl Harbor through the Philippines to Java, suddenly surged with proof that Japanese forces could be decisively beaten. War bond sales increased, industrial production accelerated, and military recruitment remained robust. Citizens who'd questioned whether democracy could defeat totalitarian military efficiency now possessed tangible evidence that American forces properly led and equipped could outfight supposedly superior opponents. For Japan, Midway initiated a psychological decline that mirrored material deterioration. The supremacy complex that had characterized Japanese military culture through early 1942 began eroding as officers privately acknowledged that Americans possessed comparable skill and superior resources. Admiral Yamamoto, increasingly pessimistic about ultimate victory prospects, reportedly commented that Japan had awakened a sleeping giant at Pearl Harbor, a sentiment that Midway confirmed with brutal finality. The confidence that had enabled spectacular victories across the Pacific transformed into defensive pessimism as strategic initiative passed permanently to American forces. Subsequent operations demonstrated how completely the carrier balance had shifted. In August 1942, American forces landed on Guadalcanal, initiating a grinding attrition campaign that Japan could neither prevent nor win. The naval battles surrounding Guadalcanal, Eastern Solomons, Santa Cruz, and the various surface actions resulted in further Japanese carrier losses without corresponding American defeats severe enough to restore balance. Each engagement demonstrated that American pilots were achieving rough parity with Japanese aviators, while American industrial production generated replacement aircraft and carriers faster than Japan could destroy them. Japanese strategic options contracted with each passing month. Plans for offensives against Port Moresby, Fiji, and Samoa were abandoned for lack of carrier support. The defensive perimeter that Midway was supposed to establish instead became a series of isolated garrisons awaiting inevitable American assaults. By mid-1943, Japan faced a fundamental resource crisis: insufficient fuel, inadequate pilot training facilities, declining aircraft quality, and carrier shortages that rendered the Navy incapable of challenging American fleet operations. Midway's 5 minutes had initiated a cascade of consequences that Japanese planners proved unable to arrest. The battle's lessons resonated through subsequent decades of military doctrine. Naval aviation had definitively proven its supremacy over battleship sea-centric warfare. Yamato's 18. 1-inch guns remained irrelevant when carriers controlled the tactical environment. Intelligence capabilities, particularly cryptanalysis, demonstrated value exceeding entire fleets when properly exploited. American damage control superiority, institutional flexibility, and industrial depth had overcome Japanese tactical excellence and warrior culture. These lessons informed Cold War naval development and remain relevant to contemporary maritime strategy discussions. Admiral Yamamoto survived barely a year after Midway. In April 1943, American coderikas intercepted his inspection tour itinerary, enabling Army Air Force P-38 fighters to ambush his transport aircraft over Bougainville. Yamamoto's death eliminated Japan's most capable naval strategist precisely when strategic creativity was desperately needed. His successors proved uniformly inferior, contributing to Japan's accelerating decline throughout 1944 and 1945. The admiral who'd planned both Pearl Harbor and Midway died, knowing his strategic gamble had failed, and Japan faced inevitable defeat. For the American commanders, Midway validated careers and approaches. Admirals Fletcher and Spruant received credit for victory, though Spruant's methodical competence impressed Nimitz more than Fletcher's aggressive instincts. Spruant subsequently commanded the Fifth Fleet through critical Central Pacific operations, his cautiousness ensuring victories without unnecessary risks. Fletcher, despite having commanded at both Coralca and Midway, the two most significant carrier battles of 1942, found himself gradually sidelined to secondary commands. The institutional Navy, perhaps unfairly, questioned his aggressiveness while overlooking his actual combat record. The torpedo squadron pilots who died attacking Nagumo's carriers received belated recognition as their sacrifices' tactical importance became clear. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron posthumously received the Navy Cross. His squadron awarded a Presidential Unit citation. Ensign George Gay, Torpedo 8's sole survivor, spent the war speaking at Bond rallies and training events, carrying the memory of 14 comrades who died knowing their attacks would probably accomplish nothing beyond creating opportunities for others to exploit. The moral dimension of such sacrifice, choosing to attack despite certainty of death, resonated through American military culture for generations. 78 years after the battle, the 4 Japanese carriers remain on the Pacific floor northeast of Midway, their exact positions located by deep-sea exploration missions using advanced sonar and remotely operated vehicles. These wrecks serve as war graves, protected from disturbance by international maritime law and mutual respect between former enemies who've since become alliance partners. The physical remnants of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiru bear silent witness to 5 minutes that transformed global history, demonstrating how rapidly strategic dominance can evaporate when operational circumstances align against even the most powerful forces. The Battle of Midway demonstrates that warfare's outcome often hinges on factors beyond material superiority or tactical brilliance. Intelligence, timing, individual courage, institutional flexibility, and simple chance all contributed to American victory and Japanese defeat. The 5 miles. Newts beginning at 10:24 a.m. on June 4, 1942, didn't merely sink 4 carriers. They terminated Japanese offensive capability, secured American strategic initiative, and ensured that the Pacific War would end in Tokyo Bay rather than through negotiated compromise. Admiral Nimitz's assessment proved accurate when he stated that Midway avenged Pearl Harbor, though the more significant achievement was establishing the foundation for ultimate victory that Japan could neither prevent nor survive. The torpedo squadrons that attacked knowing they would die. The dive bomber pilots who pressed through anti-aircraft fire to release bombs with devastating precision. The Kodarikas who stripped away Japanese surprise. And the commanders who positioned forces to exploit brief tactical opportunities, all contributed to an outcome that seemed nearly impossible when the battle began, but inevitable in retrospect.